Part 4. Earlier, we established that the seventh resurrection in the Bible, the resurrection of Jesus, fits a pattern in which the seventh is exalted. In contrast with persons who reportedly were raised from the dead to continue a normal course of life and eventually die again, Jesus is said to have risen to a glorified, immortal state. We saw that long before Jesus and the writing of the New Testament Gospels, the case of Enoch in the book of Genesis associated the seventh with an intimation of immortality. The placement of Jesus' resurrection is what we would expect in a novel or series of novels that had a unified authorship. The mystery arises because Jesus' resurrection emerges as the seventh only when we survey the books of Kings in the Old Testament and the four New Testament Gospels, all of which had different authors. Furthermore, evidence from the early history of Christianity and from textual and literary analysis weighs overwhelmingly against any theory of coordination among those writers. Did sheer chance provide the setting for what the New Testament presents as the greatest of miracles? When we return to the biblical resurrection stories for a closer look, we find that there is a symmetry among them apart from the way they lead up to the rising of Jesus. The symmetry turns on the physical states that people pass through after they die. The first such condition is the cessation of breathing that occurs immediately upon death. The second postmortem stage is the coldness of a body once enough time has passed for the warmth of life to ebb away. The technical term for this condition is algor mortis, but unlike the transitory state of rigor mortis, which sets in and then passes, algor mortis is permanent. The third and final stage of death is burial or entombment, which robs the dead of their physical presence among the living. These three stages are easily observed and require no medical knowledge to recognize. Notice how these post-mortem states figure in the resurrection stories we looked at in Part 2. In the first story, Elijah resurrected the young son of a widow. The boy died in his mother's arms when Elijah was present, and Elijah restored his life immediately. We can be confident that the boy had only reached the first stage of death, absence of breath. The second resurrection was performed by Elijah's successor, Elisha. Another young boy had died, and the mother traveled from the village of Shunem to the area of Mount Carmel, some miles distant, to find Elisha. We know that by the time the prophet returned with the woman to her house, the boy's corpse had cooled, because when Elisha first covered it with his own body, according to 2 Kings 4:34, the child's flesh grew warm. Without a doubt, the second boy to be resurrected had reached the second post-mortem stage, the coldness of death. The third and last Old Testament resurrection was the bizarre incident in which a man being interred in a communal grave came back to life spontaneously upon touching the bones of Elisha. Since this man was actually in the burial chamber when the miracle occurred, he had reached the third and final stage of death. In these three miracle stories, we see a progression through breathlessness, coldness, and entombment. Nevertheless, if you actually read the stories, you'll find that in each of them the narrative elements fit together so naturally that it's hard to believe that the author deliberately created the progression, as by adhering to a formula. What is most fascinating, however, is what we find in the New Testament now that we know what to look for. The first two Gospels, those of Matthew and Mark, report the resurrection by Jesus of the daughter of the synagogue official Jairus. The most detailed of these accounts, that of Mark, says that as Jesus was accompanying Jairus back to his house, a messenger came with the news that the girl had died. Jesus continued to the house and raised the girl up. Since Jesus was crossing the village at the time of the girl's death, he would have reached her within minutes. Like the boy raised by Elijah, the girl must still have been in the first post-mortem stage. Breathing had ceased, but she was neither cold nor buried. By the time we come to the third gospel, Luke, we learn of another resurrection during Jesus' ministry, of a young man who was the son of a widow in the village of Nain. A funeral procession was bearing the corpse to the gravesite when Jesus touched the bier and the young man returned to life. From what we know of ancient Jewish customs, the body would have been washed and wrapped before being taken out for burial. Washing a corpse hastens the loss of heat through evaporation. We are safe in assigning the second stage of death, coldness, to the young man of Nain. We only discover a third resurrection by Jesus when we reach the final gospel, John. Just outside the village of Bethany, near Jerusalem, Jesus stood in front of the tomb where his friend Lazarus had been interred 4 days previously and asked for the sealing stone to be removed. When Jesus called out, Lazarus came forth alive again, according to the story in John chapter 11. Obviously, Lazarus had reached the final post-mortem stage, entombment. To tell about life being restored to persons who have been dead just moments, dead long enough to have become cold corpses, and even dead and in their graves, is a way of showcasing God's unfathomable power over life and death in all kinds of circumstances. It makes sense in biblical, spiritual terms. The symmetrical arrangement of resurrection stories based on the stages of death is also what we might expect of an author writing a unified work. The information can be organized in a table, like those documenting the status of the seventh in Genesis. The extent of this symmetry, with 3 mortal resurrections in the Old Testament, 3 in the Gospels, and precisely 1 from each post-mortem stage in each respective set of 3, compounds the mystery confronting us. If none of the 4 evangelists was concerned to have Jesus' resurrection occupy the 7th place, neither did any of them bother to create a trio of resurrections consisting of 1 from each stage of death. The symmetry we have outlined was no more within their control than was the sequential position of Jesus' immortal resurrection. Yet somehow the symmetry and positioning both emerged. The symmetry extends even farther than we have so far seen. Recall that in Part 2 I said that 2 resurrections took place after the time of Jesus in order to validate the authority of the apostolic pillars of the early church. As related in the book of Acts, Peter raised a widow named Dorcas in the coastal town of Joppa, and Paul raised a young man named Eutychus in the city of Troas in Asia. As with the other resurrections, the Bible provides enough detail to establish the stages of death in each of these last 2 cases. Dorcas was in the second stage, coldness, while Eutychus was in the first stage. Therefore, in our final tally, we have exactly 3 resurrections from each of the 3 stages. Viewed as part of this larger array, the resurrection of Jesus can be seen as the last and most astounding example of the most astounding category of resurrection, that in which a person already in the grave returns to life. The pattern we have carefully documented can't be ignored. Even if we were to assume that the resurrection stories are pure fiction, we'd be left scratching our heads about how to explain their arrangement. The reason is that according to our best historical evidence, there was no coordination among the human authors of the relevant books. On the other hand, if the resurrection stories are contained in literary works that have what increasingly appears to be a miraculous dimension, then it is less than reasonable to argue that the events they relate could not be real because they include miracles. Besides an arrangement of resurrection stories that coincides unexpectedly with spiritual symbolism, the Bible offers us its own internal explanation of why we find such diverse documents to be so closely integrated. That explanation is twofold, consisting of God's orchestration of events and of his inspiration of the sacred Hebrew and Christian writings. God's marshaling of the forces of history, sometimes called providence, is referred to in Acts 2:23, which says that Jesus died according to the purpose and foreknowledge of God, and Romans 8:28, which says that God causes all things to work together for the good of those who love him. The inspiration of the sacred writings is reflected in texts such as 2 Samuel 23:2, which says, "The Spirit of the Lord spoke by me, and his word was on my tongue." As explanations for what we've been studying, providence and inspiration are not ad hoc. Although they do account for the orderly arrangement of resurrection stories in the Bible, they were not invented for that purpose. While we cannot relate providence and inspiration to scientific laws, they offer insight into why the stories are sensibly organized apart from human planning. To make a comparison, we cannot describe human thoughts and intentions in terms of chemical reactions, even though they are dependent in some way on brain chemistry. Yet our inability to express states of mind as chemical formulas does not mean that a person's intentions are of no help in explaining their behavior. At the beginning of our study, it wasn't clear what the stories of resurrection had to do with the question of whether the Bible is divinely inspired. I hope the connection is now clearer. The arrangement of those stories is sensible and purposeful, but not due to natural causes that anyone has discovered. It does make sense as the result of God's superintendence of historical events and human expressions. The gospel message that through Jesus Christ, God is remaking a universe crippled by sin, that he is calling all people to repentance, humility, self-control, and self-sacrifice, and that our lives will extend beyond the present world cannot be proved like a mathematical theorem. What we have demonstrated here is that the ancient body of texts we call the Bible is extraordinarily unlike any other work of literature. Filled as it is with histories told in strange idioms and passages that disturb as well as those that comfort, the Bible cannot be brushed aside as childish nonsense. And please don't conclude that the resurrection stories are the sole example of emergent organization in the Bible. We've toured one corner of a mansion with many rooms left to explore.
If you enjoyed this study, please leave a comment on our website at typologetics.com and look there for other information on science, reason, and biblical Christian faith. Thank you for listening.